Everybody, this is your Industrial Revolution lecture. This is part of our 19th century studies. And as you can see, the era we're going to talk about is based from 1750 to 1900. And I want you to really pay attention to that time frame. Maybe not so much at the beginning, but if we think of this as a chunk of 100 years, which is an age that a lot of people live to. They live to 100 years old. And as I describe this process, I want you to think about the fact that when someone's born and when someone's a kid, they might be completely used to like a farming lifestyle, a rural lifestyle, living out on the countryside. But by the end of their life, they are now seeing these huge cities just boom, just explode. And people now living in dense cities and working in factories, and machines now doing things that they used to do by hand. So just kind of keep that in your mind. What might this have been like to live through? Okay, so what is the Industrial Revolution? It's the era when production shifted from hand production to complex machines. So before this time, when people were making products, let's just take something as basic as a shirt, they would get the raw materials, they would get the cotton, but then they would make all these shirts by hand, either in like a small shop or even their home. And by the end of the Industrial Revolution, between different types of inventions and shifts in management styles, people were now producing these things using machines in factories. Okay. And why is that so important that it constitutes its own historical era? It's because of all of the social and economic changes that followed. The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain, but spread throughout the world. And we're going to see why as we keep on going. So why did it start in Great Britain? Well, they had a large labor supply. Why did they have a large labor supply? Because they had a population boom. As we learned about with the Columbian Exchange, there was more access to food, there was a greater exchange of ideas, and farmers started getting their own innovations and their own new strategies for farming. And so overall, there were better farming techniques. Better farming techniques means more food, and more food means that more people can be supported, and so the population can and does boom, it explodes. Fewer farmers are needed on farms themselves because of things like automatic seed planters and because of the improved plows that were used. So less workers were needed on farms, which actually resulted in a lot of people being out of work. So they had to go find work. Where did they find it? They found it in the factories that start to emerge in the cities. More on this to come. Also, why Great Britain? Well, let's take a look at this map. Great Britain, even though it's just this kind of small-ish island country, they controlled a whole lot of territory in the 1800s, including a portion of Canada, a portion of South America, the western coast of Africa, which we know they kind of set up shop for the slave trade, and then they colonized a great chunk of India and Australia, although not by 1800 yet. And the reason that they colonized these good, especially the coastal parts of India, was for trade and to be able to control trade. So going back to our notes here, the colonies allowed Britain to spread their influence worldwide. So if something was invented or thought about in Great Britain, they could then bring that technology, that idea, that strategy to these other places around the world. Because of the colonies, they had access to cheap labor because they either paid the natives very, very little in all of these colonies, or they of course used slaves, especially in the cases of North and South America. They also, because they had access to all of these areas around the world, they had access to raw materials. So we're going to see in a minute that Britain does have access to things like coal and iron, but by having control over these colonies, they also had access to some silks and some bronze, cotton, in the Americas, gold, and much, much more. So that's what we call raw materials. So the stuff that you make other stuff with, they had access to all of that initial material because they had access to all different environments in all these different colonies. And then finally, because they were able to be so influential in trade in general, not just the slave trade, in all trade, the colonies were like built-in markets, because Britain would bring all of their finished goods to their colonies and basically say, hey, colonists, buy our stuff. You're going to buy our stuff. In some cases, that policy was so strong that you weren't even allowed to buy products from other countries. But regardless of whether or not that was the case in every situation, no matter what, Britain had built-in customers because they had control of these colonies around the world, as you can see. Another major reason that I've already alluded to in terms of why Great Britain was its location. So not just the fact that they had colonies all over the place, but its actual location in, let's take one more quick look here, the northwestern-ish part of Europe. So what's so special about this location? Well, there was a lot of natural resources of iron and coal. If you look at this map, all these triangles, these all indicate coal fields, so where coal could be found. And the deal with iron and coal is both of those were really important material and energy sources. Coal could burn really, really hot, fueling some of the machines that were being developed, and iron was a material used to build these machines and build the factories themselves and build tools and build things like trains and steamboats. They also, being an island nation, they had many, many harbors and rivers that helped facilitate transportation and power as well. So it became easy to ship the raw materials back and forth from the colonies and bring it to England, where they would be turned into finished goods, and then those finished goods could be easily shipped back to the colonies and other customers along the Mediterranean and other parts of the world. So again, obviously harbors and rivers we think of for transportation with boats, but that water power would also be used, water would also be harnessed for power, and things like the steam engine, which we're going to hear about on our next slide. So what were some of the new examples of new technology that really changed the course of production? Well, a basic thing to write down: tools and machines developed to produce more goods in less time for less money. That's the long and short of it with all of this new technology. One of the most major industries for Britain specifically was what we call the textile industry. And I don't have that on here, but I'd like you to write that down. Textile, T-E-X-T, like texting, I-L-E, the textile industry. And that's what we call the industry that makes soft goods. So my shirt is a textile. My little hair scrunchie is a textile. I don't have any other textiles handy, but anything made of cloth, blankets, socks, to an extent shoes. Of course, they had to include some other products with shoes, but anything kind of like soft and made of a fabric. And so some of the technology that was invented was the cotton gin, which got all the seeds out of cotton, like or seeds or other just debris when it was taken off of the trees. The flying shuttle and spinning jenny, which you might be saying like, what? And it was just, without getting too technical, they were used to help weave cloth. And then the steam engine itself, okay? And this was invented by a man named James Watt. So he's a pretty important name in terms of the Industrial Revolution. And once the steam engine was invented, these machines, which at some point still needed to be hand cranked or foot cranked or operated by a person, could now be operated by a machine. Steam also allowed boats and locomotives to be built and utilized faster than even just traditional sailing ships. And the result of all that new technology was the factory system. To recap, I guess this is slightly repetitive production. With the assist of all of these machines, production shifted from homes to factories. And so the factory system was the system of production that brings machines and workers together under the control of a manager. There are many positive effects, but there are also many negative effects. One of the groups that benefited the most was the middle class. It's important to note that the reason they benefited so much was because wealth was no longer tied to family lines or land ownership. You could become wealthy by getting educated, working your way up, becoming a business owner, and just gaining your wealth that way. So you no longer had to be born into a noble line or be born into a system where you owned land. Simply by your job, you could go up the social class ladder. But levels within the middle class developed as well. The upper middle class included the factory owners, the bankers, the merchants themselves, the people who saw the direct profits. The middle class were people like the doctors and lawyers and teachers and scientists and other professionals, but maybe not the highest level of like the factory system. And then we also have the lower middle class, and these were the more basic yet professional jobs, things like secretaries, hotel staff, police officers, bank tellers, and that sort of thing. Some things that the middle class had in common were their political values and their cultural values. In terms of politics, the middle class often wanted and fought for free trade, so less taxes on buying and selling of goods, the ability to own private property without the permission of nobility, that was still fading, and policies that favored business. So basically laws, any sort of laws that helped business boom, and it did. But they also fought for social reforms in education, healthcare, and sanitation to make the cities better. More on that to come. Culturally speaking, the middle class tended to value hard work, thrift, in other words, being careful with your money, cleanliness, and strict morality. So there was still kind of a proper way to live in society to be seen as a respectable young man or young woman. And the middle class typically believed that individuals controlled their own destiny, and if they made it to the middle class or upper class, it was because of hard work and education and skill, and that if you were in the lower class or if you were poor, it was probably because you didn't work hard enough or you didn't get the proper education. Okay, so to some extent, some things never change. But that being said, this was definitely its own kind of separate era than what we experience now, of course. And then the class that definitely did not benefit was the working class. So people that were used to farm work or doing other small work in the home, and the conditions of their home, now had to work in factories. And factory work was often very monotonous, where everyone would work 10 to 14 hours a day in dangerous, filthy conditions, because the goal was to maximize profits and to maximize production of goods. The well-being of the workers was definitely not a high priority. So machines would be crammed into spaces. People would work when they got tired. People would not get work even when they got tired. They might not have lunch breaks. They might not have bathroom breaks. It might be hot or dirty. And so accidents and disease were common. And what made this even more difficult is there was no workman's comp. What that means is if you got hurt on the job, you got sick on the job, there would be no money for you. You just had to be at home or work through it, and then you're spreading your disease to other people. And you better believe that if you did try to take some days off or just not come in, there would be other people, lower class people, waiting to take your jobs, because unemployment was actually quite high when you have a population boom and so many jobs are moving from farms to factories. Families were so desperate for money and wages were so low that even children and women worked. Now, we might think, well, of course women should work. That's equal, right? Yeah, of course there was some of that where women got some level of independence by being able to leave the home and work, but that's not what was the norm at that time. It was still very normal for women to take care of the children, take care of the home while the man went to work. So it actually wasn't necessarily a good thing in their eyes at the time that women were working. Children as young as 6 would be encouraged to work. Sometimes their families just had to have them work, and everyone would work these long shifts, as I said, but into the night, which also meant the children weren't getting access to education. No education means you're pretty much going to stay in this whatever skill you're learning. That's probably where you're going to stay, because you're not getting a formal education to try to move up into some of the middle class jobs, especially if you're not being taught to read and write. What was life like for the working class? They often had to live in overcrowded, smoky cities, or the cities themselves were overcrowded and smoky because of the factory work and the burning of the coal. They often had to live in large families had to live in 1 to 2 room apartment buildings. They're called tenements. You should probably write that down. Tenements. Near the factories to make it convenient to go to work and be close to work, especially when they were working these long shifts and working late into the night. And human and industrial waste would contaminate the water supply and spread disease. There was no sewer system yet. There was no garbage system yet. So there was like garbage collection system. So people would literally throw out their personal waste or any of their waste just onto the sidewalks. And often from these apartment buildings, from up above, would just have a bucket and dump it out onto the road. And there would be no one there to clean it up. Why? Because there were very few public services. Very few things were organized at the city level to take care of people, including things like sanitation. Eventually, people are not going to stand for this. And so labor unions form and social protests emerge. And what these labor unions were is they're organizations of workers that unite to create pressure against the owners to improve working conditions. So basically saying, hey, we're all going to go on strike. You might not do anything about it when one person gets sick and loses their job, or when two people get hurt on these machines and have to leave work because you've got other workers. But if we all organize as workers and we all go on strike at the same time, then it's going to force the factory owners to deal with us and to make things better for us. Okay. So how did they go about this? They tried to cooperate at a nationwide level. So if you were a textile worker going on strike in London, then you were also going on strike in all the other major cities like Manchester or Edinburgh, other places around Great Britain. They would go on strike, as I said, and often there would be threats of violence or actual violence carried out. And then there would be collective bargaining practices where the union leaders and the employers, like the factory owners, would negotiate about the problems and come to agreements. So things like trying to improve the hours that people worked, or the conditions that people worked, or the ages that people would be allowed to work. So that would be worked out through collective bargaining. What does that lead to? The concept of socialism. And this was developed by a man named Karl Marx. He viewed capitalism as very unstable, that you cannot just have this small group of rich people always getting and staying richer. That the workers, because there was more of them, would join together and would revolt. And he predicted that at some point this would result in a classless society. So not unclassy, but like no classes, no lower, middle, or upper class. Everyone would be equal, and there would be an end of conflict between the rich people and the poor people, because everyone would just share. Everyone would help pay for everything, and everyone would share. I'm super oversimplifying, but this is the gist of it. And the major thing to know at this point in time, as this theory gained traction and spread across Europe, it inspired movements of workers and intellectuals, so people who studied these ideas, to spread throughout Europe. Okay, and that wraps up in, at least for our notes, the Industrial Revolution. We will learn more about all of this stuff in class.